Welcome back to Fascinating History, where today we will discuss the era of ancient Rome and how they treated their slaves. Status and wealth were the primary organizing principles in Roman society. Its hierarchical arrangement saw the senatorial, aristocratic elite at the pinnacle of the social pyramid. In the center were the equestrians, the plebeians, and the freedmen, in that order. Those with the lowest social position were the slaves. Unimaginable torment was a daily reality for many of the Roman slaves. After all, Roman law saw slaves as property rather than people in their own right. But slavery in ancient Rome supported much of society's prosperity, and Rome's freeborn people were significantly dependent on slaves for their world to run efficiently. So, what do you think life was like for the slaves in ancient Rome? In this video, we'll talk about a vast story of ancient Rome. We dive into a fascinating era whose history transcends time and space, illuminating the legends of the slaves of ancient Rome. Evidence for slavery. Roman literature, epigraphical sources, and archaeological findings may provide us with information on the institution of slavery in ancient Rome. Pliny the Younger's works, in particular, contain excellent source material on slavery, despite the fact that there are apparent limits placed on literature written by wealthy members of Roman society. Pliny was one of many people who had a tendency toward idealization. Sadly, there is no literature that has survived from the time period of ancient Rome that was written from the point of view of someone who was actually a slave in that period. Epitaph inscriptions provide fantastic evidence for the relationships between slaves, and former masters. Archaeological digs have been used to do significant studies on slave plantations. For instance, there are still relics of arenas from ancient Britain to Turkey. Amphitheaters were the settings where gladiators, slaves, and prisoners of war fought one another. They are a sad reminder of how pervasive the use of forced labor was throughout the Roman Empire. The life of a slave. There were several ways to become a slave in ancient Rome. One of the most common experiences was becoming a prisoner of war. As the Roman Empire expanded between the 2nd century BCE and the 2nd century CE, it was responsible for the enslavement of thousands upon thousands of its defeated enemies. Slaves in ancient Rome came in numerous forms and were integrated into all aspects of Roman life. Slaves worked in everything from agriculture to the military. It's actually assumed that domestic slaves made up the majority of the slave population. Some of them had an exceptionally high level of education or expertise, both of which made them quite desirable. It's even said that teachers for children, gourmet chefs, and hairdressers were in high demand. For urban life to be successful, an army of slaves was required. Many worked in civic vocations, including public bathrooms and libraries, and in government administration, usually alongside freeborn plebeians. On the other hand, some were prostitutes who worked in brothels run by proprietors who exercised great control over their activities. Many slaves were subjected to harsh labor conditions their whole lives. While some toiled in the dangerous mines, usually extracting rare gold and silver, others maintained the rural estates of wealthy landowners. The mines were notorious for their hazardous working conditions. Due to the harsh conditions that exist here, in fact, the average lifespan was likely a few months to a year or two. Slaves were often employed by Roman masters or mistresses as administrators, bailiffs, debt collectors, or captains of commerce ships, so that they could keep an eye on their business. One of the reasons the Romans employed slaves in these jobs was that, unlike citizens, they could punish slaves brutally if they were dishonest or incompetent. Another reason is that individuals in Roman society didn't want to give up their independence by going to work for someone else, since they valued their independence. There were several other responsibilities that a slave was permitted to carry out with a certain amount of autonomy. A talented Greek slave might easily find work in the medical or educational fields. The Greeks enjoyed an outstanding reputation in each of these capacities, and the Romans placed their whole trust in them. In addition to that, they could work as a painter, potter, or some other kind of craftsman. In the past, a common occupation for women was prostitution. In the vast majority of cases, prostitutes were subjected to horrifying conditions. They started working in their teenage years and endured various verbal and physical abuses throughout their careers. It's possible that the majority of them had the delusion that one of the wealthy customers would fall in love with them and buy them their freedom. In the work of Petronius titled Satyricon, there is a character named Asilatus who makes the claim that he freed a female slave who had shared his bed to shield her from the advances of other guys. Even while it seems negative, there have been far worse jobs in the past. A lot of Roman slaves were considered to be the most miserable if they were forced to toil in the fields, mines, or quarries. Ergostulums were the traditional housing conditions for agricultural slaves. There, they were forced to sleep in chains while being nearly worn to death by their labor. Pliny the Elder took great pride in the fact that he did not restrain any of the roughly 4,000 agricultural slaves that he had. This provided a sufficient basis for the majority of slaves in agricultural fields to rise up and lead rebellions. The majority of Spartacus's army, which he led during the greatest slave revolt that ever occurred from 73 to 71 BC and took place in southern Italy, was made up of people who were held as agricultural slaves. The number of men in his insurgent group has to have ranged anywhere between 70,000 and 120,000. Slaves in the mining industry endured such deplorable working and living conditions that they could not muster the resolve necessary to rebel. Some slaves were owned by the government and used to do chores, such as maintenance on aqueducts and roads and loading and unloading merchandise at ports such as Ostia, located at the Tiber River's mouth. Many of these slaves were also forced to spend their nights chained. Punishment for slaves. A master would put his slaves to death even if they had not been given a fair trial. They also had expert crucifixion teams equipped with all the appropriate instruments, such as boards, ropes, shackles, nails, and other necessities. After the slave was stripped, he would be flogged to the point that he was bleeding, and then he would be nailed to a cross by a group of whipmen. The legs of the slave would be broken. The Roman slave wouldn't last much more than 48 hours at the most. The dead body was left for some time for vultures and dogs to consume as a warning to the other slaves. Some people chose to be eaten by lions or have their bodies burnt alive as less painful ways to end their lives. The miserable conditions under which slaves were forced to live sometimes resulted in excruciating torment for their victims. A way out. In ancient Rome, the procedure of attaining freedom from slavery was referred to as manumission. There were a few different approaches to escaping from captivity. One of the most common approaches was participating in a competitive activity that a judge oversaw. In this part of the process, the slave would kneel before the magistrate and allow the rod to contact his shoulder. After that, they would be given the pileus, a pliable headpiece shaped like a conical pyramid that served as a sign of their autonomy. In addition to that, a great number of slaves were set free in line with the wishes of their masters. Others just had their master declare them free, at which point they were given permission to register as citizens properly and officially. Slave women also had the opportunity to marry their owners and gain their freedom in this way. This was often done to assure that subsequent kids would be born free citizens. Slavery was undeniably a morally reprehensible system in ancient Rome, as measured against today's standards. On the other hand, for Romans, at least those born free, it was entirely normal and considered a fundamental part of day-to-day life. Not until the 19th century did the so-called civilized Western nations make it unlawful to practice the institution of slavery. So what do you think about the way of life of the slaves in ancient Rome? Let us know your responses in the comment section below. And don't forget to like and share. Also, hit the subscribe button to find notifications on the latest uploads on the channel. And as always, see you in the following video.